Grave fears this weekend of a lethal response against Israel from Iran following two assassinations, one in Beirut and one in the Iranian capital. Plus, a clash of Israeli versus Israeli at a military base that some are calling Israel's January the 6th. It's unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv. The audacity. The audacity of someone covering the Middle East, thinking they could take a 4-week break. I mean, seriously, Mr. Friedland, what were you thinking? This is my Jewish way of saying, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be back, although, mixed feelings about being back, because we always said, didn't we, that if something, dark happened with the news, then I would come back, and sure enough, that's what's happened. So it was never likely to be sort of happy circumstances that pulled me back in. Somebody, a long-time listener of our podcast, in fact, I don't think he'll mind if we name David Remnick, who filled in brilliantly along with Biana Golodry the last couple of weeks. Huge shout out to both of them for sitting in this chair and doing it brilliantly. But David said it is basically that line in Godfather 3. Every time I try to get out, they pull me back in. And this time it is the gods of news, and particularly of the Middle Eastern news, as you've rightly pointed out, that, what with the events of this week, it just seemed impossible to stay away.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Biana Golodry and David Remnick. We all three of us deserve a very big thank you at the acknowledgement section of your book when it's out, because we held our part of the unholy podcast empire. But now we're very glad that you're back. We are.
Yeah, no, the Unholy Alliance has expanded to include the friends of the podcast who now have, who really did step up. So huge gratitude to them. And the podcast, I thought, sounded great, alarmingly so. Without me, I thought you don't need me there any longer. But no, we are back in business, and just huge amounts for us to talk about. And we're going to be running, through a lot of it later on in the episode with brilliant journalist Matti Friedman, who's joining us as our special guest this week. But it has been one thing after another.
Right, and there's a lot to talk about. We should just mention before we dive into it all, and there's a lot to go through, we should say that August is going to be our Ask Us Anything month, and we really want to hear from our listeners what's been on their mind. So if you want to send us a question, just follow the show notes with the very clear instructions on how to do that, or just leave us a message on Instagram at Unholy Podcast. Now, everything that has been going on. So I think we should start with the two targeted killings, actually in a span of 7 hours. One of them on Tuesday evening, the Hezbollah commander Fouad Shukr, Hezbollah's top military commander, essentially Nasrallah's right-hand man, or the second in command in this organization, responsible for really a long line of terror attacks. This was official retaliation for what happened earlier in the week, which is that 12 kids were killed in a soccer field in Majd al-Shams. We should also mention that the United States had a bounty on his head, $5 million reward for anyone with information. He was involved, among other things, in the bombing of the U.S. Marine Corps' barracks in Beirut in 1983. So no one is shedding a tear about this man. I will just mention, according to reports, and this is not because I love gossip in any way, but he was, this all happened during a visit to his mistress. I think it's important that Unholy also educates its listeners on the importance of monogamy. So this is what happened in Beirut on Tuesday. But after that, as I said, 7 hours after, an attack in Tehran, right after the swearing in of the new president. And this was a targeted killing of number one in Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, essentially the leader of the political wing of Hamas, if we were to make that distinction between the military wing and the political one, and that happened in Tehran. Importantly, we should say Israel not in any way taking responsibility for this event happening in Tehran. Also, we should point out, right, the intelligence and the operational skills that someone has to have in order to take down the number one in Hamas while in central Tehran is something that we should also probably point out.
And the third leg of this stool was confirmation that Mohammed Deif had been killed. There was some ambiguity about whether or not this long sought after Hamas military commander had been killed. They knew they'd sort of, as it were, got him, but they didn't know whether he'd survived. He had survived many times before. There was a whole kind of mythology about him known as the guest, because he would sleep in a different bed every night, more or less, always on the run, sort of Rasputin figure with many, many lives, and confirmation coming more or less as we're recording that he too is dead. So these are three very senior figures, two military figures. The third, Ismail Haniyeh, thought of, as you said, as a sort of political figure. In some ways, the most significant aspect of all of it, I think, is the fact that the Haniyeh assassination happened in Tehran. It is such a humiliation for them because this was a gathering, as you said, for the swearing in of the president. This was a kind of gathering of the clans where the proxies, the allies of Iran, were there in some ways to sort of visit the kind of, as it were, imperial capital of the Iranian Empire and pay homage. And instead, it was shown that even at a time when you would assume their security was increased, Israel was able to penetrate that security and hit Haniyeh through, very directly into the bedroom where he was sleeping while visiting Tehran. So just purely in terms of the operational, as you said, the skill required, that is something. But the politics of hitting Tehran is huge. Let's cast our minds back to the 1st of April, when it was a massive deal that Israel hit a commander of the Revolutionary Guards in a compound in Damascus that was, and there was some argument about whether, in terms of international law, it absolutely counted as a diplomatic territory and therefore indirectly Iranian territory. There's nothing indirect about this. This is the capital of Iran, and Israel has hit that soil. And therefore, I think that is why, and you'll tell us about the mood in Israel, but I think that must be why, for Israelis to brace themselves for an absolutely ferocious response. Because if you just think on the calibration, if Iran felt it had to send over 300 drones and missiles in April because a compound in Damascus had been hit, how much of a response are they going to feel that they have to, just to not lose face, come up with when a guest, as they would see it, has been hit in the heart of the Iranian capital at a moment of great ceremony for Iran?
Of course, Israelis, as you say, are bracing themselves for a response from Iran, and Iran said that response is imminent. Again, I will just stress the point that Israel officially has not taken any responsibility, and there's obviously a reason for that, right, to leave sort of a window of deniability. Look, Israel, after October 7th, obviously showed, I say tragically, vulnerability and weakness in a neighborhood which is the toughest in the world. And part of what we are seeing now, whether it be Israel attacking Yemen, the Houthis in Yemen at the Hodeidah port, whether it be taking down number 2 in Hezbollah, in Beirut, and whether it be, according to reports, allegedly taking down Ismail Haniyeh, number 1 in Hamas in Tehran, is showing this region, right, it's not open season on Israel anymore. That is an important thing in itself before you get into that discussion whether these kinds of targeted killings have a long-term effect on these terror organizations. I'm not an expert on this. There would be a case to each point, right? People would point to Ahmed Yassin being taken down, the leader of Hamas, and that deterring Hamas for a very long time from returning to suicide bombings. But that is the question. Again, Israel trying to show deterrence is one thing, and that is an important and significant thing. There's also the question of timing, because many of the families here in Israel, the families of the hostages, have been saying, wait a minute, we are on the brink of a deal after 300 days, something that we have been waiting for. And taking down this top commander in Hamas is actually saying we're at least delaying the deal for this foreseeable future. And that is a very concerning thing for these families. So this event, more the issue that what happened in Tehran, less what happened in Beirut, is something that is heatedly debated in Israel this week.
Yeah, I have taken, in terms of how I reacted to it, obviously we take the point about the operational obstacles that would have been in the way and the achievement in overcoming them. But I have taken my cue in a way from the hostage families, and they have been, several of them anyway, have raised this point about why now? That, obviously this is not a guy you would want around, but to do it just as there is this our peace talks, and particularly this is about Hania's role, which is worth saying. So he was, I think, the most senior interlocutor representing Hamas in these conversations about a ceasefire and a hostage deal. You've had the Prime Minister of Qatar, who's been a very important broker in this, saying it is very hard to move ahead with the deal when you kill the person you're negotiating with. And I think some of this has been misunderstood. He's from of course, everyone involved in Hamas, they're all involved in the heinous things that organization does together. But there are in any organization, even pretty wicked ones, arguments around the table. And Arab diplomats, quoted in the Washington Post, was saying, or one Arab diplomat or official quoted in the Washington Post said, towards the end, he was one of the ones who saw the value of a deal and wanted to reach it. So, of course, by no definition, but ordinary political definition, is Ismail Haniyeh a moderate. But in this very particular argument, where there was Yahya Sinwar on one side of the table saying, let's keep on killing and let's keep on holding hostages, and another person around the table saying, now might be the time to do a ceasefire deal and release these hostages, Haniyeh was in the latter side of that argument, and he is now gone. And so I think that, plus he was the guy doing the negotiations. And therefore you have some sympathy for those hostage families who have been saying, this looks like, in the phrase of one, a targeted attempt here by Mr. Abandonment, describing Netanyahu, not to allow the implementation of the deal. And I think that's how, I have sympathy for that. Sure, if you can get Haniyeh, we get the argument for doing that. But really, to do that now, and at a moment where a deal was apparently within reach, I'm afraid it confirms to me the very pessimistic judgment I've been offering on the podcast for a while, which is I really don't think Netanyahu wants this deal. I don't think he wants those hostages coming back, because I think he thinks that means the end of the war, and that means elections, and that means a commission of inquiry. And it's extraordinary. 300 days in, we should mention that milestone, 300 days since October the 7th, he is showing no signs of someone who is keen, let alone desperate, to get those people out of captivity.
So there's a lot going on there. I will say, first of all, that there's also a question, and maybe it's perhaps a bigger question, of the person who makes the decisions in Hamas, which of course isn't Ismail Haniyeh, but rather Yahya Sinwar does want a deal. And how keen is he? And I think that's...
I don't think he wants one either.
Right. So I think that is also something to mention. Look, these kinds of targeted assassinations need an opportune moment. And I will take you back to 2003, where all of the leadership of Hamas in Gaza was in the same room. At the time, it was Rantisi and Ismail Haniyeh and Jabri and Yassin. And by the way, Sinwar wasn't there because he was in the Israeli prison. But Israel then dropped a bomb on that apartment, but it was a small bomb. It didn't want to hurt the other people who were in that same building, and none of them were hurt. Now, you can just imagine what would have happened to our region, to this country, even to the rest of the world if that had succeeded. So again, these targeting killings have a moment. The moment was that he wasn't in Doha, in Qatar, and he wasn't in Turkey, which the two places where he lavishly lived, Ismail Haniyeh, right? And obviously, if this was Israel, it didn't want to target, because that had all kinds of ramifications, particularly Qatar, if you do that in the middle of negotiations. So the Iranian thing was an opportune moment that might not return. So that, I think, was the consideration of whoever pressed the OK button on this. Another thing to also mention about Ismail Haniyeh, and you mentioned this yourself, right? This is a man who grew up in the ranks, rose the ranks of Hamas, being the assistant of arch-terrorist Ahmed Yassin. He's also the person who connected Hamas more than anything to Iran. This is not a good guy. And when you talk about the negotiations, again, the one person who made the decisions was indeed Yahya Sinwar. So the optimistic take on this would be this delays the negotiations for a bit, but it doesn't kill the hostage deal. I hope that is where we are. As I said, this is heatedly debated in Israel this week. And I talked a lot about deterrence, and I think that is an important sort of, pillar of Israel's defense. But if what you have and what you created is a whole country that is trepidatious or a little bit trepidatious about what Iranian response might be, and there will be a response, right, as we sit here on Thursday, whatever it is imminent, then what did you do with that kind of decision? So all this is it's a mixed bag when you talk about this decision to take down Haniya himself.
Yeah, I hear that. And the other factor that planners will have had to wrestle with is, and we talked about this back in April, is, how much can Israelis take? I mean, yet another weekend where your friends, your families will be bracing themselves for what could be, a rain of fire. And Israel survived it unscathed in April. Mm-hmm. Do these actions make it more or less likely that, for example, those 60,000 Israelis from the north will be able to return to their homes? Does the Shukr assassination deter Hezbollah, make it want to stop and pull back? Or does it say, no, we're going to have to up the ante to not lose face? Always so important in the region to maintain our own deterrence, etc. I don't see that these actions bring a solution. I think it's interesting what you said about Yassin, and that's an interesting thing. Does removing these leaders actually bring you long-term quiet, or does it? Do these people just get organically replaced by someone else who pops up?
And by the way, you can ask this about Al-Qaeda and bin Laden and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and ISIS. But at the end of the day, I think the problem is this all leads back to one sort of pivotal question. What is the strategy? Is it more important to take down Yahya Sinwar, or is it more important to have a strategy in Gaza to prevent Hamas from being the sovereign the day after the war ends? It is, I think, does deter terror organizations for some period of time when you take down the leaders. But you have to have, this is not only a tactical success, you have to have a strategy and a long-term strategy. In some cases, it's going to be more complicated, but you have to have that.
And I think this is the one thing, by the way, that you get on which you get the broadest agreement, that is what has been missing in these long 300 bitter and terrible days. What has been missing is a strategy, what the game plan is, what happens the day after. There is just a big echoing void where there should be that. We have never heard that articulated. And in a way, if there were one, it would enable people to then understand these decisions, to think, okay, that isn't just, I think your word is right, tactical. That's not just tactically impressive. People could think, well, I understand now what goal that serves. Instead, you have the hostage families just thinking, what now? Just as we're about to get a deal. You have exhausted, their nerves shredded Israelis thinking we're going to have to get another round of incoming fire. We went through this in April. In Gaza, people desperate for a ceasefire after 300 days of this and a death toll approaching 40,000 by some estimates, which I know are disputed. So, if we continue to wait for something like a strategy.
So while all this is happening in Israel, obviously a huge other story erupted earlier this week. It happened at a detention facility, the Sde Teiman detention facility. What started this whole thing was a decision made by the military advocate general to detain for questioning 9 reservists who are suspected in, I apologize, I know this is a show that drops on Friday, but we have to say the facts of this case of aggravated abuse and sodomy of a Palestinian arrested in the Sde Teiman facility. The Palestinian was arrested in Gaza. Now, what happened was at that moment where the decision was made, right-wing politicians, and particularly it started with members of Knesset from Itamar Ben-Gvir's party, decided to show support for the soldiers being detained. And they essentially, and this is a dramatic red line crossed in Israel. They essentially broke into the facility, claiming that this shouldn't be done. This is just to kind of understand and why this was compared sort of immediately to the riots on January 6th of 2021. This is a major thing in which Israelis in the dozens break into a military base in 2 cases in one day. They are led by a minister, Amichai Eliyahu of Otzma Yehudit, Itamar Ben-Gvir's party, and other members of Knesset who are supposed to uphold the law in this country, and decide to actually start a fight against it, to the extent that the military chief of staff saying this is endangering the country that is in war, and he himself has to physically arrive at the scene to protect or to show this sort of protection of the soldiers. It was a moment that I don't remember a lot of these and this is saying something. It was a very sort of depressing sight to look at when you're an Israeli and looking at these images this week.
Yeah. No, in fact, it was this event, even before it had the assassinations, that led you and I to be in touch and say, okay, obviously I'm coming back, because this is a hugely serious moment. I don't think the foreign press or observers overseas have really processed it, because it's been overshadowed by the more dramatic events in Tehran and in Beirut. But the comparison with January the 6th, 2021, the storming of Capitol, is not spurious, because what was on the line here was the rule of law, and the people challenging it but sabotaging it were people who should be upholding the law, namely politicians and members of the government, not even opposition parliamentarians. Our friend on the podcast, Amos Harel, wrote that this incident appeared to mark another milestone in the disintegration of Israeli society. I mean, that is a very big thing to say. And he was not alone in worrying that this was a sign that Israel was somehow falling out of control. Things were spiraling out of control, somebody sent me the Yeats poem, things fell apart, that there was this sort of seriousness about this. Now, why? It seems to me that this prompts, and maybe it's perhaps because I've been away for this for a couple of weeks, but taking a step back, it seems to me Israelis, and I would say Jews, but if start with Israelis, have to make a very big decision, because this is now really in a way a test. Who governs Israel? Who is actually in charge? Because there are institutions of the state, the law, the army, and for a while, but this has been the most visible demonstration of it, you have had these people who've been allowed in. The foxes have been allowed into the henhouse, and I mean here Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. One, a thug with a record of incitement to terrorism. The other, a fanatic. They're both, the terms are interchangeable, but let's use those, who have been given this position in the government where they are really hold the whip hand over the prime minister, and what they say goes. And crucial, and this is why the parallel with January the 6th is there, Netanyahu's silence, absence, delay, hours went by before he said anything. His statement very similar to Donald Trump on January the 6th, a sort of bland call for calm. It was only a statement. He didn't, say it in person, didn't put it on social media and so on. Allowing these people to storm a base as if they should be capable of making the decisions. That is a challenge to the institutions of the state. And this has gone on and on and on, where these people are in the driving seat and making the decisions. The reason why I say this is a question, not just for Israelis, but for the Jewish people, is I think they embody a form of Judaism that elevates affiliation to the tribe above all other moral values. And I think the important point is that they were not, those people gathering outside the base, I don't think they were saying, look, these people are not guilty of this crime. I think they were saying that this was not even a crime. People can look up and see the details of what is alleged here. And you have to have a very strong stomach to tolerate what is alleged in this case. I think the people, as I hear it, the arguments of those standing outside the bases was not that this is some kind of mistaken identity and someone else did it. I think they're saying, sure, this happened. We don't consider it a crime.
I mean, you're not wrong in the sense of what this was, right? A crossing of a line in a way that even if whoever wanted to ignore this fact for more than a year, that there's a sizable minority in this coalition that doesn't accept the authority of the state or the government or the coalition, which they are a part of, right? That is not even the worst thing about this story, as you say. And when Netanyahu let the farthest of the far right into his government, thinking that they can be in some ways controlled, taken over, that this tiger can be tamed. I think that the answer this week was a very, very loud one. And again, when you gave Itamar Ben-Gvir the keys to the police, and many Israelis have noticed, it's not perhaps a coincidence that it took some time for the police to show up. Soldiers were physically attacked by this mob of people. I mean, this is something that Israelis are going to have to deal with one way or another. And I think that this was a very cruel sort of wake-up call to the situation that we are in. I mean, definitely.
I think you've mentioned such an important point here, which is that the police's inaction, their failure to turn up, and the police are now under the overall supervision of the Public Security and National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. And it's shocking to me how quickly the culture of that institution has changed. And I think there are lessons there from other places around the world, how quickly these things turn around. Look, if people are not persuaded by the moral argument about this, a couple of other things they should think about. One, the warning that Hamas will retaliate and inflict terrible pain and damage on Israeli hostages, and those warnings have come. If there are, evidence that Palestinians are being abused in this way, the head of the Shin Bet has made that argument, Israel's own intelligence service. Also, you think about those warrants at the International Criminal Court. Israel's defense relies on the idea that they don't need the International Court to maintain the rule of law because Israel has its own judicial system. If the Ben-Gvir mob have their way and the rule of law cannot be advanced and the military police cannot detain and prosecute abusers, well, then actually that's a huge argument taken away from Israel's own defense. That's if you're not persuaded by the moral argument. I would urge people, though, to be persuaded by that and not come up with the usual defense, I think, that some people want to reach for. And it's partly emotional. I do get it. That it's so awful to imagine this. And people say it's a few bad apples. It's a few rogue guards at these detention facilities. Don't judge everyone. Again, our friend Amos Harel was very strong on this week, saying these are not isolated cases. Even if the political and military leadership claim otherwise, the sad truth, he writes, is that this has dragged down everything that's happened since the horror of October 7th has dragged Israel down into a vicious circle of violence and revenge. And he gives very specific examples of that. I think it's important to, stare in the face what this represents and how it has to be tackled and addressed, from the roots, I would say. And that is going to be very, very hard and very painful. But something has happened in a very rapid fashion. And at the least, those people at the head of it who are sitting inside government, they have to be expelled from it. And I go back to my basic point politically. How on earth is Yoav Gallant, who is the defense minister, while his own IDF that he presides over is under attack like this, sitting in this coalition? To leave this government, take 5 people with you. If you're ambitious to be defense minister, sit as defense minister for one of the opposition leaders. Benny Gantz will give you the job. Do not allow this government to stay in place even a single day longer.
This reminds me of one of the military analysts in Israel who once wrote a piece that was titled, "Let the IDF Win." And I remember looking at it and saying, why didn't I think of that? That's just a brilliant idea. If Yoav Gallant could take 5 people with him, he would, but he can't. And I think what he thinks is that the way to defend Israeli democracy is to actually remain in government. You can argue that, but I think that is what he believes. But I do want to take it back a little bit because you did say a lot of things about Israeli society. Most Israelis still think that these allegations are morally reprehensible and that whatever was done there is terrible. Not because the criminal court needs to, look at Israel, not because of anything besides the fact that there is a big difference between us and our enemies. That for the most part, we don't do these kinds of things. We find them reprehensible. We condemn them. I have yet to hear anyone on the Palestinian side who's a major, political operative fessing up to what happened, the rapes that happened on October 7th. This is what most of society thinks and still thinks, right? And thinks that this should be investigated. So just to put that on the front burner here for this conversation, not because this is something that would damage Israel in the long run or in the short run. It's because it is, on the merits of this, a terrible, terrible story.
Just one small thing I would mention in that context. this video that went around this week on social media showing troops from the 401st Armoured Brigade recording themselves blowing up a water storage facility in Rafah. And they said they were doing it in honor of Shabbat. Okay? I think that's a challenge to Judaism. This is being done in the name of Judaism if they're saying they're doing it in honor of Shabbat. And Jews, religious or otherwise, around the world have to. And I know, we're in a sort of defensive posture. We've been in that for 300 days where we want to defend Israel against all the defamation of it that happens in the world's press and in the protests. We've somehow also got to find room to deal with this because this is a challenge to our most, closely held values. And I think it flared up this week.
I think the issue here, when you're looking at soldiers in Gaza in tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, and you're, I think, isolating certain incidents. You can say they're isolated or non-incident, but you're pointing to certain incidents, which is a legitimate thing to do. And I fear that when there is this view of Israel, the world expects, or world jury knows to say to itself, I hope, that Israel is not in any way on the level of Hamas, right? Israel is a country, it's a democratic country, its military is fighting a very difficult war. This is not like a terrorist organization. But there are somehow expectations that this war will look different than any other war that any other Western country has fought against a terrorist organization. By the way, no one has fought this kind of war against a terrorist organization. So I think that is a comparison that makes it very, very problematic and troubling for many Israelis. But again, I'm not sure this is the sort of episode to go into this, but I think it should be something that we would discuss very soon.
I agree with that. And also we do have a guest on hand who thinks about these issues very deeply, has himself worn the uniform of the Israeli army, has served indeed in Lebanon, which has been so central to the news this week, and has just been writing and thinking about these issues really perceptively for a long while. And we thought he'd be an ideal person to speak to after this very dramatic week, but also at this landmark moment in the war.
Matti Friedman is a journalist. He writes for the Free Press from Jerusalem. He's the author of 4 books, and he's one of those rare people who knows how to look at the paradoxes of the Israeli experience at any given moment and make sense of them. I'm very envious of this talent of his. Matti, thank you very much for talking to us again on Unholy.
Thank you so much for having me.
Your recent piece is titled, from this week, is titled Whiplash in Israel, and you write, is Israel a shambolic society torn by internal dissent or a superpower capable of stupendous military feats? This week, it's both. So I guess I want to open up by asking you, we are 300 days since October 7th. Which threat is more dangerous to Israel, the internal rift or the external one?
Wow, that's such a great question. And it's hard to believe that it's been 300 days. I think if I had to choose, I would say that the internal one is more dangerous because I don't really think that there's an external enemy that can really defeat us. But I think that the internal divisions in this country and poor leadership and a lack of agreement about what this country is and where it's going, that definitely has the real potential to blow the society apart. And it was already happening before October 7th. So in a way, we got a kind of a short reprieve after October 7th, and many of the issues that went down into the basement for a few months have now resurfaced. And I think with the right leadership, these problems could be solved. These are self-generated problems, unlike our problems with the broader Middle East, about which there might not be that much we can do. But our internal problems are ones we can solve because they're ones we're creating, but it can only be solved with the right leadership. And that's just not the kind of leadership that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just pick up on your phrase there that Yonit quoted about torn by internal dissent and the prompt for your piece, which was this scene at the military base, the detention facility at Tehran. Explain to people from the outside why that struck you as being so grave.
I mean, there's the crime itself, which was being investigated, which is incredibly grave. It's the abuse of Hamas suspect who's being held at the facility, not the first allegation of abuse at the facility. And the military police were investigating several soldiers who are serving as prison guards. They're reservists. So clearly, we have a military at war. Bad things are going to happen. Not everyone's going to be disciplined. People are under incredible stress. And we need the rule of law to keep things in line and keep the society functioning, and that's what the military police is. And we have a military justice system that is meant to take care of such things. The problem is that there is a small but increasingly powerful minority in Israel that believes that the rule of law is a kind of elitist Western weakness that works against the capability of the Jewish people to achieve their destiny, or kind of an elite that is seditious in some ways and is preventing the people from expressing their will, the people being them, the same minority, which is, I guess you could call them fundamentalist, often affiliated with the settler movement, but not only affiliated with the settler movement, and it is very much not the entire settler movement. So we're talking about the far right in Israeli politics, represented in parliament mainly by Itamar Ben-Gvir's party and by Bezalel Smotrich's party, and increasingly by parts of the Likud. So it's not that it's the majority of Israelis, but it is an empowered minority that speaks with increasing volume. So they seized on this report that soldiers were being arrested for abusing a prisoner. They seized on it as proof that, Western elitists inside the system were going after brave fighters who were unjustly accused of crimes. And instead of just complaining about it on Facebook or trying to do something about it in parliament with their parliamentary representation, they mobilized a mob, and soldiers had to be called from more urgent missions defending the borders of Israel in order to quell the disturbance. And the chief of staff himself, who was busy planning for the actions that we saw the next day in Beirut and in Tehran, had to be called away to an Israeli army base inside Israel to try to establish order after soldiers were attacked by other Israelis. So it was an incredibly disturbing incident. And I think in some ways it's been pushed aside by the more dramatic events of the past few days. But I think it would be a grave error for us not to look it right in the face and understand what it means.
So let's look at straight in the face. And it was such a grave moment. I think there were many Israelis that day saying that they hadn't felt this despondent since October 7th. Because of that, those images, and anyone who knows this country and realizes what the military is and how significant it is, to think of people breaking into a military base and what a red line that is, or used to be at least until this week. I mean, there's something that you said, I think it was even more than a year ago when you were talking in a rally in Jerusalem again, that there was protesting the judicial coup. And you wrote this again in your piece for Free Press. You wrote about Lebanon, actually, when other people were looking at what the judicial coup is doing and comparing Israel to Hungary or to Poland up to a while ago. And you wrote this: for a moment, Lebanon, a sunny and prosperous country on the Mediterranean coast, allowed itself to descend into mismanagement and civil war, appeared less like a military threat than a vision of Israel's future. Now, we are in a week in which Lebanon is also a military threat. But talk to me about that fear of internal strife turning into that kind of country, of Israel turning into Lebanon from the societal aspect of it.
Because of my own strange personal experiences in Lebanon, both as an infantry soldier inside Lebanon in the late 1990s, and then as a visitor in Lebanon, I went on a trip to Lebanon with my Canadian passport in 2002 and wrote a book about Lebanon called Pumpkin Flowers. And so I've thought a lot about Lebanon, and I think that there are two Lebanese threats to Israel. One is in the form of Hezbollah, which is a Shia militia, an arm of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard that is the most potent Iranian proxy on our borders. And the threat from Hezbollah has been playing out here in a very visible way over the past 10 months, and particularly since Saturday, when a Hezbollah rocket killed 12 children who were playing soccer in a Druze town on the Golan Heights. And that's one Lebanese threat. But for me, perhaps even the more potent Lebanese threat is the possibility that we will turn into Lebanon. And when you visit Lebanon, you realize that these are two very similar countries. And I think most Israelis don't necessarily realize that because they haven't had the opportunity to stroll around Beirut, which I had simply because of an accident of my birth in Canada. But, you're in Beirut and it's a lot like Tel Aviv, or at least it was when I was there. This is a while ago already, but it's a bit liberal and a bit conservative and a bit Middle Eastern and a bit Western. And it has beaches and it has ski slopes and it has business and it has religious fundamentalism. And it's all very, very familiar. And Lebanon starts out with big dreams, and Lebanon's a great place in the 50s and 60s, and they just can't keep it together. And their leaders sink into corruption, and the state is parceled out among different sects and different religious leaders and different militias. And effectively today, there is no state of Lebanon. It's just a name and some stationery probably that says State of Lebanon, but de facto it's not it's not a country that can assert sovereignty over its own territory. And the most potent military force in Lebanon is Hezbollah, which is not the Lebanese army. It's a militia that's operated by someone else. So I think the lesson for us from Lebanon is not just to be afraid of Hezbollah. The lesson is we cannot allow ourselves to go there. And the processes that we saw before October 7th, which is what I was talking about in that speech, the processes were very familiar to anyone who knows about Lebanese history. So we saw Netanyahu in this latest incarnation of Netanyahu, after he's reelected in the fall of 2022, he behaves in a way that is very different from the relatively cautious leader that he was before. He brings Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is a hooligan from the fringes of the right in Israel, someone who'd never been in government. And he not only brings him into government, but he puts him in charge of law enforcement. So Itamar Ben-Gvir is now in charge of the police. The treasury is given to Bezalel Smotrich, not just a mainstream representative of the settler movement, but from the messianic fringe of the settler movement. And he's also given a piece of the defense ministry. And you see this process where the state begins to be divvied up among different political actors who have very different goals for the country, which are not the well-being of all Israeli citizens. And anyone who knows Lebanon's history, I think, saw a big red light blinking very urgently over these moves. And that's what I was talking about before October 7th. And that's what I saw this week with those scenes at the army bases.
I mean, the thing that Lebanon is famous for, besides hosting now Hezbollah and posing this threat to Israel, is civil war in the 70s and into the 80s. There were people who were struck by the events this week in Israel who said, look, it sounds hyperbolic and people are very fearful of overclaiming, but the civil war is a possibility. And people were saying it during the judicial coup protest. It was the first time I sort of felt you could see how it would unfold. And, you know, they'll pitch battles between, or almost as if, you know, the IDF belongs to one part of Israel and the police to another. You began to see how the actual, almost the contours of such a battlefield would look. What's your view? Is that, you know, as I said, is it hyperventilating to think like that? Or when you have that echo of Lebanon, is that horribly what you have in your mind?
No, I don't think it's hyperventilating at all. And I think you did see a hint of it. We're not there yet, but you saw a hint of it in these events at the army bases. For example, the police who should have prevented the riots at the army bases were not in evidence. And there is some suspicion, including a suspicion expressed by Israel's defense minister, that the police were not in evidence because the minister in charge of police not only identified with the rioters, but had representatives of his party who were with the rioters breaking into the base. So it's not, you know, in Lebanon, it's not just that parts of the society begin to act in a violent way. It's that parts of the government serve different parts of the society that are using violence against each other. So if we have a situation where the army represents one part of society and the police represent a different part of the society, or perhaps different parts of the army represent different parts of the society, these processes are extremely dangerous. And it's a process of, I guess you'd call it sectoralization. There must be a real word. I just made that one up. But when you start splitting things into different groups, it has been underway in this society and other parts of government because of Netanyahu's leadership style. And it would be a disaster if that happened to the army. And it's happening. We're watching it happening. And this leadership is not preventing it. It in some ways is encouraging it. So at the same time, we're facing a half dozen Iranian proxies on different fronts, and we're in a fight for our survival, and our society's under incredible strain. And at the same time, we have to deal with this internal chaos that is not being combated by the government. In some ways, it's being fueled by the government.
So, Matti, you mentioned this. I think a lot of Netanyahu's critics or opponents would say that moment that he gave the reins to Itamar Ben-Gvir is probably the irreversible moment of his political legacy. There are a lot of people who say, listen, you need elections in Israel as soon as possible. He needs to leave the political arena. Would that solve the problem?
I guess it depends who replaces him. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's definitely true that Israel cannot heal with the same leadership in place. And it's quite shocking, to be honest, that we've just experienced what may be the greatest tragedy in the history of the state, an absolute collapse of both military leadership and political leadership. And it's been 10 months and we have more than 100 people still being held hostage, and the same people are in their positions. I mean, the prime minister is the same prime minister. The defense minister is the same defense minister. The chief of staff is the same chief of staff. And even the head of military intelligence, who is responsible perhaps more than any other single figure for the military failing of October 7th, is still in his job. So as a citizen, it's clear to me that we can't even begin the repair that needs to happen until there's just a broad change in everyone who's leading the country. And I guess the idea that things will get better after Netanyahu leaves is predicated on the idea that better people will take his place. I think that is true. But at this point, I think we need different people. We need to take the country in a different direction, even if it's an interim period before we figure out exactly what the next stage of our national life is going to look like. But there's no question in my mind that a decade and a half of Netanyahu has been more than enough for this country. And I think that if he really cared about the country, he would step down and let a younger generation take charge.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you on this. I think it's may not be sufficient, but it is necessary. You know, in other words, it may not solve the whole problem, but you're not even going to begin to grapple with the problem until you do. And I share your astonishment. 300 days in, it's incredible to me that they were still there 3 days in, but 300 days in is jaw-dropping. I want to go back to another one of your pieces when you, very smart move to reread or pick up again Netanyahu's autobiography, which in a way was overtaken because it came out about a year ago and I think would have had a longer tail than it did. It was immediately, in some ways, rendered redundant or out of date by the events of October the 7th. But you picked up the book again and read it in the light of October the 7th. And I just thought that was fascinating what you felt it told us about him, that actually not just stands up, but in some ways gives new insight into what we've seen these last 300 days.
Yes, I can't say that I really enjoyed reading the book. There have been other books I've read recently that I've enjoyed more, including one about a prisoner who escaped from Auschwitz. But what was very interesting about the read is that it's quite a different book after October 7th. So it comes out about a year before October 7th. And it's very much a self-serving political biography. I mean, anyone who's expecting something like Churchill's My Early Life will be very disappointed. Netanyahu doesn't have the same kind of self-awareness and humor that Churchill brought to that book. I mean, Churchill has an incredibly large ego, but somehow in his writing about himself, he disarms the reader by admitting it. I mean, yeah, it's quite a trick. Netanyahu can't pull it off, and it ends up being quite a defensive account of his political career. And as I write in the essay for the Free Press, it's also a reminder of the many things he got right. So it's not purely an opportunity to criticize Netanyahu. He was talking about Iran long before most of Israel's leaders understood that was a threat. He understood, I think, correctly that the problem is not the absence of a Palestinian state. The problem is the presence of a Jewish state. I think, unfortunately, that's been proven correct. And he had many other, dark and negative takes on the Middle East over the years that people like me, who are of a more, I guess, sunny and liberal disposition, didn't want to believe. But I think after October 7th, certainly we recognize that he was right about a lot, but he was also wrong about a lot. Because the book was written before October 7th, he kind of trumpets decisions which seemed good before October 7th, but which seemed disastrous after October 7th. And that's what makes the book so interesting, in that had he written the book after October 7th, he would have either played down those decisions or presented them in a different way. And just to give you one example, he describes the round of violence in Gaza in 2014, the Gaza war of 2014, which at the time seemed awful, and relative to, the tragedy of the last 10 months seems quite minor, but it seemed big at the time. And he says there were cabinet meetings, and this young rightist minister for whom he has very low regard, Naftali Bennett, was pushing to go into Gaza and remove Hamas once and for all. And he disdains Bennett for thinking this way, and presents himself as the responsible statesman who decided otherwise. And of course, after October 7th, it's clear that this was a bad decision, because had Israel taken out Hamas 10 years ago, we would have been spared October 7th, and Hamas was much weaker 10 years ago. And the Middle East wasn't a safe and friendly place, but it was in better shape in terms of our own interests than it is now. So he was very proud of kind of shooting down Bennett's proposal at the time, but when read after October 7th, it reads quite differently. And there are a few other examples of things that seemed good to Netanyahu when he was writing the book, which seem very, very bad now. So I think actually that the book could be of great interest to any commission of inquiry that's convened to investigate the events of October 7th. should one ever be convened. And at the very least, it'll be of great interest to the eyes of history.
Obviously, there's a lot and a tendency to focus on personality, and a lot of Israelis who would say, just solve this issue of Netanyahu and everything will go back to normal. But when you think of what happened, and we're talking again 300 days after October 7th, what happened to Israeli society? And one of these things we used to walk around and talk about the one soldier, right, that was held by Hamas for 5 years, Gilad Shalit. And, the pressure, the public pressure to have him released. There was a deal that was made, I think about 1,300 prisoners. One of them was Yahya Sinwar himself. Netanyahu went for that deal. But that just the public sentiment and the worry and the concern around one soldier, to say nothing about Ron Arad, right, the navigator who never came back. Now there are 115 Israelis held by Hamas for 300 days. That's almost 10 months. What happened to us as a society that there are large parts of this country that don't think this is the most urgent thing to do? How is that possible?
I think it's a real change. In some ways, one person is worse than 250 people because one person, everyone in the country knew Gilad Shalit's name. Everyone knew what he looked like. We called him in Hebrew, Haben Shel Kulanu. He was everybody's son. And public sentiment could really focus on one person. 250 is so, which is the original number of hostages from October 7th. It's such a vast number that the individual almost fades. And I happen to know one of the hostages. I'm actually going in a few hours to march with his family in Jerusalem to mark 300 days since he was taken captive. Hirsch Goldberg, Poland, who was at the music festival and lost his arm and has been held hostage since then. So I'm very aware of the individuals behind the number. But I think that there is something about a number that becomes almost a statistic that is easier to kind of gloss over than a single face. And it's also true that Israel is a different country than it was 10 years ago. We've become coarsened, I think, just by being in the Middle East and having to deal with the kind of things that we have to deal with. I think there is a sense that an excessive focus on the hostages and excessive sentiment devoted to the hostages actually weakens our negotiating position. And here I think that the right has a point. Because if we're, focused on bringing the hostages and we're saying we'll do anything to bring them home, then of course that bolsters the person you're bargaining with. So it's very much, as awful as this sounds, it's very much it's a market negotiation. And if the enemy thinks we really care and will do anything to bring these people home, then the price goes up. And so that is a position that I think does need to be taken seriously. So it's not all callousness or the fact that, people have become dehumanized. Some people would say that part of the reason that the right is less interested in bringing the hostages home is because most of the hostages are from the left. And, of course, one of the secret mechanisms of October 7th is that it's largely a catastrophe of the left. Those are the people who live in the kibbutzim along the Gaza border. Those are the people at the music festival. There are, of course, many, many exceptions. And, of course, Sderot and Ofakim are also hit. But to a large extent, the brunt of the terror attack of October 7th is borne by the left. And, it has been suggested that were there 100, young women from religious settlements being held hostage in Gaza, the position of the religious right would be quite different. And I think that there's something there as well. But it's been, a terrible 10 months for Israelis. The hostages are one tragedy, but not the only one. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of families have lost children in the army. People are mobilized to deal with this war. And the debate about the hostages is a very complicated one. And I don't, I have my own views, but I don't necessarily think that everyone on the right on this issue is wrong or inhuman. Often they're motivated by a desire to, get us through this, win a victory, and make sure that this never happens again.
And you mentioned Hirsch Goldberg Polin, who you're going to be marching for later, and his mother, Rachel, was a guest on this podcast and did say when she spoke to us that, it will say something and something, not good about Israel if it does not bring these hostages back home. And I think for the reasons we've been talking about that coarsening or that lack of caring that the society can live with 150 people not brought home. This week, the other side of the whiplash that you wrote about, on the one hand, there was this sort of January 6th style event internally. Externally, these two assassinations as we've been speaking, confirmation that a third assassination, namely of Mohammed Deif, a Hamas military leader of long standing who had eluded Israel's reach for a long time, that death now confirmed, as along with Ismail Haniyeh killed in Tehran, and a very senior, long-standing Hezbollah leader in Beirut. These things link. I mean, one of the hostage relatives, Sharon Lifshitz, was on the one hand, sort of, I suppose, speaking, there will be people very impressed by Israel's reach and military power. But she said this week, her father, Oded Lifshitz, is a hostage. She said every time there's a possibility of a deal, something happens. The question is, why now? Do you think that the Israeli military planners should have paused before doing either all of these, or certainly the killing of Haniyeh, because of the impact it could have on getting hostages back? Or do you think that kind of steel that you were referring to needs to say, no, we're not going to focus on the hostages, we're going to do whatever it takes militarily to defeat Hamas?
I think if a hostage deal were, a matter of 24 hours of negotiations and they're back, then I think they should have definitely paused any military action in order to enable the hostages to come home. That's clearly not the case. And given that Hamas is holding the hostages, I think sometimes we kind of trick ourselves into thinking that bringing them back is in Israel's hands. And even the Israeli protesters against the government, they call on the government to bring the hostages back. Israel is not holding the hostages. Hamas is holding the hostages. And I think we have to remember that. And we're in a war with Hamas, which includes the hostages as one of the important components, maybe the most important component, but it is a broader war that has to be won. Hamas has to be defeated. This can't end in a ceasefire, and it can't end in some kind of de-escalation that allows Hamas to do this again in a year. And given that that's the case, I think that, the decision to take out every single Hamas leader who's responsible for October 7th is the right decision. And I hope that Haniyeh is not the last.
It was interesting. I mean, since you're one of those people who, I think you're probably one of the first who was talking about the way that the world sees Israel and what the media gets wrong about Israel. This is an interesting week in which, again, every week since October 7th was a test case in this, and your article now needs to be a 3-book trilogy, but I'm just thinking just the way in which Ismail Haniyeh was, labeled as a moderate and a pragmatist in Hamas, which is always funny. It's like, what are you comparing him to, Satan, when you say that he's a moderate relatively? But I think there is a point that was made, and I'm wondering about this just following Jonathan's question, that he was the one negotiating. And the minute that you take down the person who's negotiating, you're going to inevitably have a delay in these negotiations.
I'm not sure how much clout Haniyeh really had in negotiations. I'm not involved in it intimately. The guy holding the hostages is Yahya Sinwar, who's in Gaza. So Haniyeh, just for listeners, Haniyeh is not in Gaza. He moves between two main locations, Qatar and Turkey. One of the kind of interesting wrinkles in the story of October 7th is that Hamas, to a large extent, is operating out of Western allies. And I think that's a key part of the picture. But I think if Hamas wants a deal, they'll get a deal. If Hamas doesn't want a deal, they won't take a deal. And I don't think the assassination of a Hamas leader is necessarily going to change the equation to any great extent. If it does, I think it puts increasing pressure on the organization. I think Hamas is losing. Mm-hmm. I think that's also important to say. I mean, Israel just took out one of their top leaders and there was no rocket fire because Hamas capabilities have not been erased, but they've been greatly degraded. They've lost thousands and thousands of soldiers. I think Hamas did not think that Israel would be able to come into Gaza and keep this going for 10 months. Every tunnel, every basement, every weapons storeroom, and we've lost hundreds of soldiers and we're still doing it. And the world is jumping up and down on our heads and we're still doing it. And I think that they're surprised by that. And I think we need to keep hitting them until that problem is solved. If we need to pause in order to get our hostages home, I'm for it. And, if that pause needs to be 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 4 months, or 6 months, I think we need to do whatever can be done to get our people home. But the war is not over. We saw something on October 7th that I think we can't forget. I think there's a temptation to accept deals that, talk about de-escalation and maybe peacekeepers. And, we've been through this in 2006 in Lebanon, where Israel de-escalates, allows a UN force to come into South Lebanon to serve as a buffer between Israel and Hezbollah. The UN force is completely ineffective, and Hezbollah just rearms basically underneath the UN peacekeepers who are essentially just getting in the way of Israeli responses. So we can't allow ourselves to go for those for those solutions at this point. And I think we really need to do something very complicated, which is get our people home, win the war against Hamas, deter the Iranian access, push Hezbollah back from our borders, and do all of this without losing our soul, which kind of brings us back to the beginning of the discussion. And that might be the main national goal for Israel in the next generation. We're not going to see peace accords of the kind that we imagined in the 1990s. We're not going to see a military victory that reshapes the Middle East of the kind that we imagined in 1967 or in 1982 when we went into Lebanon. What we can hope is to create a bubble in which Jewish and Muslim and Christian and Druze citizens of Israel can live in peace, while the people inside don't lose their humanity and don't get dragged into, cruelty of the kind that we saw at State Tehran, or, we don't want our democracy to fray further. We need to remain as liberal as possible. We need to remain close to the democratic world. And we need to do all of that while conducting a very awful war that is being condemned and misunderstood by a lot of our friends. So it's going to be a very difficult trick to pull off. It's possible. And I say that it's possible because I've seen Israel carry out really miracles over the past 80 years. I mean, the country is just a refugee camp in a war zone 80 years ago. And if you see it now, we've done pretty well, and we can work similar miracles in the next 80 years. But in order to do that, we're going to need different leaders. We need leaders who can really understand the reality of 2024 and act accordingly. And unfortunately, the leaders will not come from, the left as we might have imagined in the 90s. It might look more like a center-right government, something that's more traditional than the founders of Israel would have envisioned. But I think with the right leaders in place, we have a bright future ahead of us, but that's a big if.
Matti Friedman, thanks so much for talking to us on Unholy.
Thank you again for inviting me on.
Thank you, Matti. So first of all, our very careful listeners would pick up on that shout out to Jonathan Friedland's book, The Escape Artist, right? He did say that he enjoyed that. He enjoyed that more than he did Netanyahu's autobiography. But besides that, I mean, it's always great to talk to Matti because he really knows how to put in words what I, fail to do quite often, which is to kind of try and explain he called it the Israeli whiplash, and that kind of is what this week was, that kind of negation or contradiction between this sort of internal rift and the amazing capabilities of this country on the military level, on the intelligence level, and other levels. So I think it was really great to talk to him. Yeah, and I certainly don't think you failed to do that, but it was very good to hear him bring his very particular take to it, and the journey which he sort of implicitly described there, from being a sort of liberal Canadian guy who has now lived in the Middle East for decades and serving in the military. His views have evolved, and he explained that very, very directly. We should get on with our awards to hand out. That is our tradition, and we begin with the Mensch Award. I was going to give an early shout out to Dolan Abu Saleh, who is the mayor of Majd al-Shams. What a terrible, terrible week, but he is coming for a lot of praise in the way he's handled this. One reporter who was there saying he's a capable and visionary mayor who hasn't seen his own kids or slept since Saturday, as he's been holding that community together after the killing of those 12 kids, teenagers on the football field just a few days ago. So a mention certainly for him. Yeah, no question about that. I mean, the whole community obviously has been reeling from this terrible, terrible tragedy in the whole of Israel. There's another Mensch Award nominee this week. News really breaking as we were recording that Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter, the first American, if I'm not mistaken, to be arrested on charges of espionage in Russia since the Cold War. He's been in prison since March of 2023, now released in what what seems to be a larger prisoner swap between Russia and Washington as a sort of signal, Putin signaling that he wants to do a deal and talk to whoever will be the president after January. And this is sort of a symbolic clearing of the slate. There are a few happy families in the United States right now, but obviously this story getting a lot of attention over the past year and more even. And now this is some good news. I mean, we've been talking about such horrible news during this episode of Unholy. This is some good news coming out of Russia.
Yeah, I was one of those people who was worried that maybe he was going to be in that prison cell for months and years and decades. And it's a great relief for him and for his family that he's out. So a worthy winner of our Mensch Award, although I don't feel we're completely done in that category.
Not really. We wanted to give a Mensch Award this week to Gaia Glaser, our editor in the past 2 years, who is leaving us, I want to say temporarily, to study computational biology. She's smarter than both of us, Jonathan. We just have to admit it. And we wish her Godspeed and good luck. And we will reel her in, but we wanted to mention that as well.
Yeah, no, Gaia has been a crucial part of Unholy for these 2 years. Computational biology, I couldn't even tell you what it is, let alone study it. It's so impressive, Gaia. Huge luck with that and with everything you do, which you will be a smash at. So to our Chutzpah Award, I thought one very clear and obvious contender for that. It relates to the race within a race that's going on in the United States. Obviously, big drama while I was away from this chair with the stepping down of Joe Biden, Kamala Harris making all the running as the presumptive Democratic nominee. So all the competition and excitement is about who she will pick as her running mate. And there is a campaign already up and running to ensure one candidate is not chosen. There's been a lot of talk about Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, probably the most visible Jewish holder of office. Maybe he'll, Chuck Schumer, majority leader in the Senate. But otherwise, Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania. A campaign has started to urge Kamala Harris not to pick him. The slogan, No Genocide Josh. NoGenocideJosh.com is their website. They say no to Genocide Josh Shapiro for vice president. These are people who believe, there's apparently campaigns been put together by congressional staffers on the hard left, members of Democratic Socialists for America. They're exercised, obviously, about the Gaza war, and they believe that somehow Josh Shapiro has been too supportive of Israel in this period. Yair Rosenberg of The Atlantic has made the very effective argument that if you actually look at what Josh Shapiro has said on this issue, he has been no more supportive of Israel than any of the other names that are in the frame, whether that's Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona or Pete Buttigieg or any of the others. But some reason, the people who are excised by this issue have latched onto Josh Shapiro. Rosenberg makes a really, I think, effective case that it's somehow because Josh Shapiro is the only Jew in this field. If when you look at the record of the statements, there's probably no other rational way to read it because, as I say, if your issue is Gaza, then you would have a beef with any of the other names in the frame, but there's only a campaign to stop Josh Shapiro. So I think a Chutzpah Award to the founders of that effort. We don't know who Kamala Harris is going to pick, but one thing is decided, and that's this week's Chutzpah Award. No
disagreement there. And I hope she picks the best candidate. And the religion is completely not relevant in this case. So we're winding up our conversation. We shall also mention again, the Ask Us Anything August campaign that we are launching. So please look at the instructions in our show notes. And please do send us your questions. We really love getting them from all across the globe and answering those questions.
Yeah. Last time we did it, there were such great questions that came in. There is a way that we can hear your voice, I think, for some of them. We can make sure we get written ones if that's out of reach. But it really, really worked last time, and that's a little experiment we want to make sure we throw it over to you for August.
Indeed. And we will say our thank yous to Gaia Glaser for the last time for now, Omer Primat, Omri Barak, and we shall meet next week, Jonathan.
See you then.